Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Don being joined today by Chris, Robert, and Dylan. That's actually easy to do because there's no distinguishing which Eric. When we're able to do that, it actually works pretty well. So good to have the rest of these members of the team here today. And so we normally do this. We normally end up, I won't say wasting time. We normally use about 2 to 3 minutes with the wraparounds. I'm going to get us more straight into the episode here. So Dylan, we're coming with your topic today. So we're going to be coming back around to you. I'm going to hand it over to you in a minute. So I'm going to hold you off for just a second. I'm going to let Robert say hello to our listeners.
Hello, everybody.
And
Hi,
to get
people.
since we're rushing, Chris has said it. It's official now. We have an episode to go. Dylan, I'm going to pass it over to you today for our listeners. We're going to explore. Actually, it wasn't even on our topics queue list originally. We have a good queue list that we've built, and we've even put out our Discord channel suggestions from our listeners about what order they'd like us to tackle some of the things that are there. But Dylan brought a
probably ignore you.
Yeah, well, good things come to those who wait, Chris. That's what I'm saying. But Dylan brought an interesting one that he had sort of done some of the research on, but hadn't brought to the team. So when we were talking about what we're going to record today, and also holding off on a couple of things, I know there's a couple of things that a couple of our other members want to participate in, which is also not going there. Dylan, I'm going to hand it over to you. We're going to talk about railroads. We're going to talk about trains. So I'll let you just set us up as we go forward from here, and most importantly, about where those trains go in the United States.
Yeah. So unfortunately, before anybody asks, I wasted all 30 minutes of the time we spent before this not thinking of a Thomas the Tank Engine joke to start us off. So I'm going to apologize on the front end for that one. The idea that we're going to explore is the Transcontinental Railroad in the United States. In our timeline, it started from Council Bluffs and kind of Omaha and sort of a combination of eastern railway heads, and extended sort of over Kansas and Nebraska through, sort of the flyover states, the grain belt, a lot of that, and went west until it finally met up with the other end that had been going from California at Promontory Point in, I believe, Utah. 1869, it was finished up. So it was started basically as a way to link the two western and eastern halves of the country in the aftermath of the Civil War. So basically, you've got this massive manpower project that links the ideas of the two halves of the country, the sort of civilized East and the sort of wild, savage West, they like to present it as a moment of national healing, but let's be honest, it was all about grabbing as much money as you could get. If you've watched at least a couple seasons of Hell on Wheels before it just kind of turned into a soap opera, you may recognize some of the building of this. But today, we're going to explore what if that things went south in a kind of literal sense. What I discovered, this is an old idea, but there had actually been some earlier proposals for a Southern-focused transcontinental railroad, even before the Civil War. I actually didn't realize until I started looking into it, a lot of the early railroad development in the United States was in what states of what would be the Confederacy. The first functioning steam engine that was ever used for commercial purposes was used on a South Carolina railway line. One of the first big overland mail routes was done basically from the South through sort of the end of West Texas and further out east to California. There's even a guy who had a proposal in the early 1840s, so even pre-Mexican-American War kind of era, who basically wanted to build a railroad because his experience on a boat was so miserable that this man decided to annoy national figures because of how miserable his boat ride was. I encourage everybody to look up the story of Asa Whitney for that one. So basically, the idea is, what if the Transcontinental Railroad at some point was built south instead of going through sort of the northern end? And to kind of you shut me up for a little bit, I'm going to throw it to y'all to see if you have any ideas about sort of where we want to go with that fork, or if there's a spot we want to start with.
So I think we kind of decided on the 1850 solution. And basically what we kind of thought about was, well, if you look at American history after basically like the War of 1812, it's a series of balance. It's a series of balancing acts. There's the Missouri Compromise that admits Maine and Missouri. There's the Compromise of 1850 that admits California is a free state. And the federal government has to pass a fugitive slave law, on and on. There's always this kind of idea that if the North gets something, the South has to get something as well. Any parent with multiple children, I think, understands this. So that's what this is all about. And we were sitting here thinking, well, what if in 1850, after the Mexican American War, what if the United States, what if the compromise was, instead of admitting California as a free state and passing a federal fugitive slave law, what if the compromise turns into, hey, listen, we just made the Gadsden Purchase, which is a little strip of land in Arizona that basically makes this whole thing a lot easier instead of having to go through a much more mountainous territory. We just took all of this new land. We just spent, this money to adjust the border a little further south to make this possible. What if we decide to go ahead and pour a bunch of money into an infrastructure project in what is going to be the South to basically use a southern route to build a transcontinental railroad to connect California to the other states. And I think what we discussed was and I think Dylan did a good explanation of, listen, there's only a couple of places. Once you get below like St. Louis, the Mississippi gets so big, there's not a whole lot of places you can cross it easily with a bridge, especially given the technology at this point. So one of those being, and I don't know why he's fixated on this city, but Dylan said one of the really easy crossings would be Memphis. So kind of a crossing from Tennessee into Arkansas and out from there, I think Amarillo you mentioned through the Panhandle.
It goes Little Rock first,
Okay.
then hits Amarillo.
Mm-hmm.
And then dips south of Indian Territory, basically.
Okay. So that's the route, and into what are the territories of, actually the territory of Arizona, as I remember, right? It's not split yet.
I think you're
New
right.
Mexico territory.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And out into the new state of California.
Yeah, and what's intriguing about me about that, Chris, we were talking through, one of the things we've talked about before is we look for plausible forks. And I think, we're not exploring an implausible fork here. It's just, figuring out where that fork would be and what it would be. The more as you were explaining that, Chris, because we were talking about this off podcast before we started recording, is you're admitting California in 1850. So the logical trade-off is we're going to put the rail route that goes now more into the southern part of California versus the northern part of California. Although it should be noted, there was already, considerable settlement in Northern California, in the Bay Area, San Francisco, et cetera, already here. But you already had the divide starting to happen even as far back as 1850 between, North and South California being very different for lots of reasons. A lot of that being just the pure geography of it. So I like the idea of this being the, what year did Henry Clay? If Henry Clay's around, he's looking for a compromise. Mm-hmm. That much I know. So I don't know what year Clay died, but I can easily imagine him, fashioning something where this was what was there. And the other thing to remember here, you said you used the right word, obviously, there, Chris, infrastructure project. Let's not forget, and Dylan, you said it in your setup here. Yes, this was about the fact that you needed to have a rail line and you needed to have the ability to trade. But at the end of the day, this was about and will be about money and who's going to benefit from it. And so one of the things is, if you're pumping federal dollars, which is what was going on here into this process, you're pumping those federal dollars into the economy, generally speaking, of the South and moving towards the Southwest. There's an element, I think, that's attractive to that, just in my, not thinking too deep into it kind of thing, but, thinking through it enough just to say, I can see that actually happening. It's plausible enough, if that makes sense.
And the other thing I'm thinking about, I'm envisioning this almost as like a steam-powered Lewis and Clark expedition. Hey, listen, like, we just got these new territories. And there's kind of a push to assert not northern, not southern American influence into this area that is still not really settled by Americans, is still a little wild, and to kind of shore up the southern border.
Yeah, and the other thing that goes with that, too, actually, one of the interesting thanks to Dylan for his background notes because it's in the links that he had here. But the detailed surveys that went on that really are you mentioned Lewis and Clark. These are the follow-ons to Lewis and Clark when you're actually going, because now you actually have to do a level of detail survey to figure out elevations and passes through mountains. You're gonna have to deal with the mountains at some point wherever you deal with them, how high and what nature of it. But the things I was reading here is just how incredibly detailed these surveys were. It's like the railroad became the Louisiana Purchase was the original reason for setting out Lewis and Clark to go and survey this land. By the way, they were one of 3 expeditions that Lincoln sent out. They were just the one that actually went and made it back. But then the other thing is to your point, Chris, we've now bought this land, even if we haven't bought this land, we sort of are possessing this land. Either
We paid for it.
We paid for it.
Treasure and blood.
Treasure and blood. That's a fair thing to say. But now that's understanding, okay, what do we got? Well, part of it is we got to build a railroad across it. So that's one of the reasons we were surveying what do we got? Where can we build this? What'll work?
I mean, keep in mind, this is also the same time that Jefferson Davis creates the U.S. Camel Corps to operate out in this area.
Yeah.
Well, and you have the development. So assuming we have a railroad that goes south starting in the 1850s, one of the first mail routes goes actually from Memphis and St. Louis, like we talked about, through the Indian, territory and through Texas. So you already have essentially a route that is naturally developing. And if you're already going to have a mail route, you might as well just put a railroad on it, because you're already, you're not path making to the same extent that you need for a railroad grade, if you're just talking about horses. But, that's a significant amount of traffic that you can present in terms of, using it on a set route that's already being developed lowers your sort of upfront infrastructure surveying and costs and things like that. The only question is actually, where do you start from? And that's the one problem that I will admit with the setup is one of the reasons why they like the upper Missouri is because it doesn't move. In the Mississippi, it moves. I forget what I read. I want to say at the time it was moving upwards of potentially 5 miles at some spots, over the course of the bank, because it was still just a wild river. Everybody, kind of took it, but nobody had built it up. So you have to find a place like Memphis or like St. Louis or even Vicksburg that could work, that's high enough that you could use it as a base and try and stabilize it to get across. New Orleans is not going to work for that. Honestly, I think you're probably going to see a split between St. Louis and Memphis, because St. Louis is north enough that you can reroute some of the other infrastructure that's on the river, and they would meet up someplace like Arkansas, Little Rock, and then kind of go west. I think what this gets us into is, what does this railroad through Virginia and South Carolina and Tennessee and Mississippi and Alabama and Texas and all that, what does that do to the development of the South in the 1850s, thinking in a sort of storm clouds on the horizon kind of sense for what we all know we're building up to? My immediate tactical thought is that puts a whole lot of railway depots in a whole lot of southern places where you have some, potential for kind of Fort Sumter type shenanigans. But you're also looking at, connecting industries. You're looking at connecting, resource areas, whether that's the Pine Belt in Mississippi and the plantations throughout the lower South. What do we think starts kind of going on with that?
Well, one of the things.
Go ahead, Robert.
One of the things is one of the North's biggest advantages during the Civil War was they had a standardized railroad gauge. So the U.S. military engineers were able to cut U.S. Army railroad engineers, trying to get the right word here. They actually had a huge advantage because they could just take one set of cars and run everywhere. The South, if they were trying to move things around, they had to go so far, stop, change everybody over. And by the way, if you're changing a division level army at that time, that means you had to move the men, the wagons, the artillery, the horses, the pack animals, the wagons from one to the other, and that takes time. So now, because now we've got one railroad going out to California, which, by the way, that also opens up the cotton trade in the Pacific. if you need it. So now we can ship cotton west, not just east. And so now we're also looking at a standardized gauge across the world. So where when, and I'm not going to say if, I'm going to say when things finally come to the Fort Sumter shenanigans head, Dylan, I love that analogy. The South is operating from a manufacturing industrial difference than occurred in the real timeline.
I'm not
Yeah,
sure. And
yeah.
the reason is this. We've set out to do it.
Right.
And the federal project is going to start in Memphis. Let's say that the federal portion of this starts, West Memphis, Arkansas, or maybe even building the bridge over the Mississippi. How quickly is it able to actually is it even across Arkansas yet in 1860 when things happen? How quickly does this happen?
I think it purely becomes a question of how early does it start? Because I know that's the other thing that Dylan was suggesting is, does it start earlier? Because the momentum was there to do this. Dylan, I'm sorry to cut you off. The momentum was there to start it earlier than we actually did, right?
Yeah. And I would say, so say if we do it as part of a compromise of 1850, call it probably starting in 1852 after you figure out all of the legislative and, logistical moving of stuff you need.
The environmental impact surveys.
I'm pretty sure in the 1850s nobody knew how to spell the word environment, so I don't think we knew what that was.
We moved quicker back then.
Yeah, well, we moved quicker, but we smoked more, so it evens out. So you're probably, the real Transcontinental Railroad took 4 years, but that's admittedly a fractured and in need of healing, but a united state that can throw its whole weight behind it.
And has done 4 years of a master course in how to actually use
engineering
right.
and logistics and all that. I think it's probably a safe bet to say you at least need the time doubled, if not more, because you're looking at less experienced engineers and you're looking at other projects that are all getting divided because you've got you just have a less developed West because it's had 15 years of less time for people to move out there, get in shape, all that. Some of that is countered by the fact that you've had people in Texas for a couple hundred years by now. So I imagine there's going to be some kind of, Texas and Indian, railroad company that's going to start in, Austin or Dallas or Houston, or whatever the big cities were back then, that's going to try and start meeting them. Because that's what happened with all these. It was all these different companies that did chunks and they just had to, connect four to get it all to work together. But I would be surprised if it wasn't at least mostly done in Arkansas, assuming we have a 1861 Civil War start. But I don't think you'd have it much past mid
California.
Yeah. I was going to say I would be surprised if it had gotten to like Lubbock. You've probably got sort of mid, East and mid Texas at least kind of linked up, but Lubbock's just going to be, prairie grass and dead camels everywhere. I don't know.
I think East Texas definitely gets hooked up.
Yeah.
What
especially when you think of Galveston and Texarkana linking with New Orleans, I think that's too easy to not do. And then
go ahead.
No, go ahead, Don.
Well, I was going to say that, to me, what I was trying to balance in my head is, I agree with you. At least it's double the length of time that it took in the real timeline, just because of, what set up the speed of that success. You elucidated it very well there. Then, so then what I started thinking is, okay, even if it takes double the time, let's say it kicks off in 52 or 53, 1852, 53. And let's say, we're still on that collision course for an 1860 election that's going to be the catalyst for, what's going to be the catalyst. Is there enough time to have enough economic interweaving now between the North and the South? To me, the one thing that can delay the Civil War is if, there's the philosophical reasons that this is going forward, and there are economic reasons that tie to those philosophical reasons, obviously, that are there. But, at some point, if everybody's making enough money and everybody's economy is okay, it's a lot harder to go the route that you are. That didn't exist in the real timeline 1860. There was nothing that was sort of a check to that from an economic perspective. In fact, I think you would argue, if anything, there was more of a thinking of, we now need to do this because we now need to do this. And I just don't think I go through that long explanation saying, I don't think that there's enough time to start seeing the benefits of this infrastructure program and how it's improving trade and the economy in such a way that it's enough of a counter to the political forces of secession.
If anything, this encourages it.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
Because it makes, certain right now, if you look at like where in the South, we're thinking, by the way, about call forward to another episode about a Tennessee Union area, or we're going to be this might be the kickoff of our Civil War arc for a while.
This might be this might be the unofficial prequel to the Civil War arc that we've been talking about internally as a team. Yeah.
But you do have, if you look at areas that were pro-secession, the one distinguishing the one geographic factor was navigable rivers that would allow you to produce massive amounts of a product. Some places that was indigo or rice or tobacco or cotton, and move it to somewhere you could sell it. Railroads just open up that much more territory to this kind of economic activity.
Yeah, because I found a statistic here that talks about, because they do this all the time in these sort of comparative studies. The 10% of the country's economic capital was in the South, even though they had an important distinction here when we're talking about the antebellum South. They had 25% of the free population, and God knows how much of the probably 95% of the enslaved population. But a railroad existing in 1858, 1859, by the time you get to sort of good enough for government work completion rate, let me just put it that way, it might move another 10 or 15% of the capital down in the South. And especially I'm thinking in areas like Atlanta, Memphis, Mobile, Montgomery, because you've got some of the shipping ports that are down there. I don't know that you're going to see widespread capital, allocation in areas other than that. And I don't think it's going to get enough to really, it's going to be enough to make the war slightly more annoying for the Union. I don't think it's really going to do much in terms of, maybe we add 6 months to it or something like that. I think you're still done in 65.
So the place that I go there, just in what you just said there, my simplistic way, because sometimes I have to get it simple enough in my head before that I can lay the details on top of it. I think of the agrarian South and the industrial North. I mean, that's the way I think about it. I think that's a fair, it's a generalization. It's a broad characterization. It has all the negatives of that, but I think it's a generally accurate generalization. And I guess my point, and the point that you just made there, Dylan, and others have made here, there's not enough time to alter the balance of that industrial versus agrarian in such a way that it really alters much. And in fact, the argument can be made is the industrialization here really is transportation that yields benefit to the agrarian. So you're really not changing anything. You're just multiplying something. Did I get that in a way that makes sense?
Yeah.
Do I sound like I'm right?
Yeah, there's there's going to be some natural accumulation of industrial output, I think, but you're looking probably less in terms of coal and steel plants and more like lumber yards, because that's the one other resource you have a lot of naturally in the South,
Right.
other than things that grow and things that you eat. So I think you're going to have more lumber yards and stuff like that. Like I said, you may have some more port activity. I'm curious if the cattle industry in Texas is going to get a boon out of this, but I think that's more just a question of them going east instead of north to catch the railroad. So you got rough equivalencies there. But yeah, I think, like I said, I think it may make the Western campaign in the Civil War a little bit more difficult for the Union in terms of individual things that they have to do. But
if Memphis is the head of this, and we've gone as far as into Texas with it at a minimum with some tie-ins, the siege of Vicksburg becomes the siege of Memphis.
Yeah, which It makes it. I will say this: it makes Memphis last longer in the Civil War because in the real timeline we didn't do a whole lot. But that does mean that my favorite story about Memphis in the Civil War, where some local civilians locked the Union garrison on the top of a roof when they went to change the flag, probably doesn't happen.
So to play through the Memphis connection, I mean, Grant is raising hell in Tennessee in 62. Does his proximity to Memphis, I mean, I think we can agree that even if Memphis is more important, it's not going to fall on the same day as Gettysburg.
No.
So what does that do?
Grant does not stop at Pittsburgh Landing to set up, so we don't get a Battle of Shiloh. He goes straight into Corinth, and Corinth ties you straight to Memphis. And it goes in. So you in essence, you go Henry Donaldson, Nashville. We skip over Murfreesboro. We go to Corinth, and we go east. Chattanooga becomes if anything, he splits his forces and goes that direction. But more than likely, if we're trying to really, really seal off Anaconda, forget it. We're not stopping. We're going straight down into Corinth and then heading to at that point.
So when does that lead to a siege of Memphis? When's Memphis?
May 1862. It basically a month or two later than the actual Battle of Shiloh occurs.
So then the question I have is this: does Memphis hold out? How long does it hold out? And what, we always argue about, some people think Vicksburg, some people think Gettysburg. They happened on the same day, and things, for the lack of a better, pardon the pun, went south real quick after that. Does a fall of Memphis in May of 1862, because Vicksburg has not been important as a crossing, because the crossing effort has been up in Memphis, does the fall of a Memphis in 1862 change the course of things so that now you're pushing up Atlanta, you're pushing up all these other things? And as I remember, Robert E. Lee is just taking command. This is about
that is 100% correct. that happens about the same time as Shiloh happens, at pretty much at the exact same time. And so if Grant, I think Lee still takes over, but he's at the height of his power. But I honestly think this also accelerates Grant's rise to prominence.
Okay.
Well, and maybe Sherman's too, because Sherman's also in the Western Theater. So, especially if you've got a railroad that, already crosses over the Mississippi, I don't know that Sherman would have been stuck with the sort of trans-Mississippi side of that, but they would have had to send somebody down to try and get the West Memphis side of the bridge just for security's sake. Does that then mean that Sherman's a little more prominent, and Grant? And the other thing that I thought is, even if Memphis is the new kind of Vicksburg equivalent and it falls earlier, does that change the march to the sea from Atlanta to further south to go through, especially in a more industrialized South, not a hugely industrialized, but, Memphis is close to Birmingham, which is where one of the main ironworks outside of Atlanta for the Confederacy was, out in Tredegar. And then you've got Mobile, Montgomery, down to New Orleans is already gone by this, but those might have held out. So does it shift more south and then hook into Atlanta?
I think it shifts more from a march to the sea to a march to the Gulf.
Yeah.
What you might see there.
He goes exactly the path Dylan just described.
Yeah. And beyond that, now he has potentially, Sherman is one of the one of the earliest and most powerful, proponents of total war. It's the war not just of men and military material, but war on the economy. I mean, he would have been using the rails and destroying the rails just as much as he did, just in a different way, but using them a whole lot more in terms of being able to be more mobile. And Sherman being able to move faster is a pretty scary thing for anybody that's trying to stand against someone Sherman-esque, but particularly Sherman. Sherman is the one who brings this to the prominence when he does, in a big way.
But we're ignoring what the other side is doing now. I mean, when in the Overland campaign, one of the issues is Lincoln is trying to get the Army of the Potomac just to engage Lee so that he can't go west. If the West falls apart at this point, right after the Army of the Potomac has basically been kicked out of the peninsula, and Lee is the hero and everything, do we get a Lee Grant showdown out west at a Battle of Birmingham, something like that?
So at some point, Lincoln boards a train, which is the irony of this, right? To go and deliver a speech at a cemetery for a battle that didn't happen at Gettysburg.
Potentially.
Well, I wonder if it's going to be Lee, because he just wasn't, you've got so many other, and this is just an argument more of convenience for, physical proximity than anything else. I think especially where they're, a Confederacy that's lost Memphis quickly and is facing basically the attack on what remains of their Gulf Coast industrial complex, they're going to go probably one with somebody who's local, and two, somebody who already has some experience, if they can find anybody, in raiding Union supply lines and fighting guerrilla war. And there is very much already a guy who's out there who does that, named Nathan Bedford Forrest. You've also got some other guys like Beauregard, some other people that basically they've got a pool of guys who probably wouldn't be as good as Lee, but also would be good enough for the time.
Also a personal favorite of Robert. I think he's about to mention him.
Albert Sidney Johnston.
Yep.
Because Johnston does not die at Shiloh in this timeline.
Yeah, because Shiloh doesn't happen.
And according to Robert E. Lee, James Longstreet, and Jefferson Davis, Johnston was their best military mind. He was actually the commander of the Western armies of California prior to secession, and decided to go with Texas as adopted home state and join the Confederate Army.
So am I hearing a scenario here, which I think I'm hearing here? We're not talking about a prolonged Civil War. We're theoretically talking about a different abbreviated Civil War.
Yeah, I think it's going to be. I think it's going to be shorter and meaner. I'm reminded of what was it Curtis LeMay said about war after bombing the Japanese in World War II. That at that point the whole point of war was to kill as many people as quickly as possible, to just make everybody cry and go home instead of deciding to keep fighting. I think you might be looking at sort of that kind of a situation where instead of, it's not protracted, but it just becomes so much nastier, especially with industrial buildup, supply line attacks. I think it's going to become more of more attritional, not that it's going to be a huge kind of like stalemate, but I think you're going to see more of kind of a grinding down to the Gulf instead of sort of wheeling around.
I think that actually helps in this way. In our Civil War, I mean, we just celebrated Juneteenth, which is the commemoration of enslaved African Americans in Texas being told you're now free 3 months after the war actually ended. I think this could help long-term stop the Weimarization of the ex-Confederacy in a way that, there's no way you can pretend you didn't lose this war.
Yeah.
It came through your backyard.
Yeah, I think
it wasn't just ground you down in Richmond.
Yeah, it was you guys got beat and everybody watched you guys have to get smacked all the way to Mobile and Montgomery.
And so, the place that I go there, and we hadn't even talked about this before we started recording. I hadn't really even thought it through. So this is the scary thing you get when Don's mind starts going into motion and it hasn't had a lot of time to cogitate on what it's saying, which is always a dangerous thing. But, if you, and I agree with what's been said here, I think it is a different war. It's a war that has a far more Western flavor than what we often think of it having. I think it's a more brutal war. It's more of a modern war, which is, yeah, I think one of the arguments to be made about the American Civil War is it's one of the first real modern wars, but it becomes even more modern in what's there. But also, if you end it sooner and you end it more, if you will, more decisively in that sense, or in some way of the lack of denial that, the actual is over, there's a defeat, whatever's there. I think you do change the post-war situation in interesting ways that are very dramatic. I mean, we're talking about a theoretical outcome here that allows the war to be over by the election of 1864. That may be stretching it, but it's possible. I mean, it wasn't that much long after the election of 1864 as it was. And all you have to do is accelerate it, less than a year to get to that point. And if the outcome is inevitable in the time that you're leading up to the election in 1864, that's a very different election probably in 1864, right? And then once you change that election, you have the typical thing we always run into. What are the ripples that flow off of that?
Well, McClellan's a non-factor in an 1864 election in this timeline. In addition to that, I'm going to throw out little Johnny Boy and his crazy band of merry men don't get as riled up or organized, so Lincoln survives and is still around during Reconstruction.
Which I think leads to a really interesting
change
in Reconstruction, because you take Johnson out of the picture, which means you may actually have, ironically enough, more of like a Marshall Plan kind of Reconstruction instead of let's let the foxes back in the henhouse kind of Reconstruction, which sets up really interestingly, one of my favorite periods in normal American history, which is sort of the closing of the West in the 1870s. Once you have, sort of the Civil War done and over with, and, everybody's put their guns away and gone back home. I think Lincoln probably easily wins re-election, and then who comes after him in 68? Because I still think you're going to have a Republican, at least another 2 presidents probably.
If Grant wants it, he gets it.
It's Grant.
That's what I'm thinking. He may
the only question is, Chris, I think you had the actual right phrase. Grant really only wanted to become president because he saw where Reconstruction was and decided to go, and he was kind of like, I'm going to go in to do it. I don't know if, barring that, he would be drug kicking and screaming even more than he was as president at that moment.
I think he would be very popular if they could persuade him to take it, because he'd basically be a new George Washington. He'd be seen as sort of a second American Cincinnatus. But I don't, just knowing Grant, I just don't know if he would take it or not. I'm kind of on the fence about whether, I'm sure there would be enough people who try to get him to do it. But I mean, who else would it be potentially that I'm thinking? I mean, would it be, God forbid, would it be like Sherman or somebody? Or
look, in our timeline, what is a Sherman pledge? A Sherman pledge is actually a thing. In our timeline, even as screwed up as Reconstruction got, they tried to convince Sherman and he wouldn't do it. So I don't know that this is any different. Just to put a name out there, maybe like a Benjamin Butler.
Or so here, so I've
what about Stanton?
I was going to say Schuyler Colfax was the vice presidential nominee. Salmon Chase apparently was one of the proposed candidates. I'm just going down the list here just to see. Hannibal Hamlin, his first vice president from Maine. I think you've got your free choice of any, other presidential candidates. I think those are probably your main ones. So I guess we'll say, just for the sake of convenience, maybe Grant gets persuaded to run because nobody else is seen as a real, successor to a Lincolnite Republican. Stanton and some of the others, they've all got their own kind of problems.
It's gonna be a military. It's gonna be a general.
Yeah.
So there's not a place for somebody like a Seward or somebody like that.
Not
Yeah,
yet.
not yet. Although the real kind of a random thought is, does Seward then buy Alaska?
Well, there's a podcast I'm aware of that talks about alternate history that's covered that as a topic at some point, and probably needs to go back there because it was an early episode. But we think of that as being a not big thing, and until it becomes a big thing eventually down the road, and not just in manifest destiny going in a more northwest direction, but also Russian presence on the North American continent, how that interplays with the British, still occupying where they were, and in the north, in the what is now the northwest United States. That's a great question. I don't
So
know,
this is
Dylan.
it's 67 and the Russians have already lost in Crimea. So yeah, he probably does still buy it because this is pre 68. Or maybe we say that Seward's folly is what helps torpedo his Republican nomination because everybody thinks he's an idiot for
Yep.
buying Alaska.
There you go.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then Grant comes in. Okay, so we got our political.
That's how you
taken
get
care of.
that's maybe how you get Grant off the bench in our
Yeah.
scenario here. But the other thing that really struck me when you said it, Dylan, that I was trying to think, whose plan would it be filling in as the substitute for Marshall here? But this idea of a reconstruction that is a lot more like a Marshall Plan style versus
I will say it's a Sherman plan.
Or is it a Sherman Longstreet plan? Do you
I think
have more cooperation from some of the former Confederate
Longstreet would,
societies?
because him and Grant were friends, and Longstreet is the one Confederate who he's the one Confederate who basically crossed over to the other side because with the statement of we're a conquered people and need to behave as such.
Well, and if you're
comes into
talking about
play.
reconstruction of like a Gulf states region, Longstreet's posted up in New Orleans after the war. So I mean, there's not a more natural place to run all of that out of.
And as I remember, if you go to Savannah, Sherman's house is still standing there.
Mm-hmm.
He had a Southern presence. So I think we need to make this a hard, short, horrible war and cooperate afterwards. So it's especially this might be what Grant or Lincoln convinces Sherman to do. This is something close to his heart. This is something that gets him off of a political bench to become Commissioner of Reconstruction, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then here's the next one. Guess who gets to be president after Grant? Sherman.
I don't.
Yeah,
think so.
I want to see Sherman turning his focus out west, especially if he's a commissioner of Reconstruction. I see him maybe being a territorial governor or, even a secretary of the Interior or whatever they call it back then.
Regardless of how they want to portray themselves, nobody has ever made it to the American presidency by accident without wanting it themselves.
George Washington. With that exception.
Maybe
debatable, but we can leave that one for another day.
but I'm really interested. This is where I think we will come back at some point after we clear some other things out of the queue because I want to do that. But the topical queue. But this idea of if you alter the war, which leads to an alteration of Reconstruction. If you alter Reconstruction, now you are dealing with something that really can have a long-term ripple impact in terms of, accelerating through Reconstruction / reconciliation in such a way that it is proactive and positive versus what's there. Do you change the next 100 years of civil rights as we understand them by accelerating some things there? Maybe not. There's some forces that are just going to be harder to overcome just because they're harder to overcome. But ultimately, there's a technology shift. Part of what made things is eventually, the you might argue the cotton gin is one of the things that causes the rise of the need for slave labor in the South to harvest the crop. But eventually you reach the point of creating harvesters that allow you to do that using industrial technology in such a way that you no longer need the human labor to do so. And the intersection of those timelines and industrial development to me are interesting. So if you can alter what's going on to those points, I think you can have some really big changes in the big timeline moving forward.
Yeah, and I think that comes out of some natural, assumptions about, even take something as the opening and closing of the West. If we have after the Civil War, you don't have all of this money, all of this stuff going through Kansas and Nebraska, even if at some point you're going to, they're going to do another line out there, but you've got it going further south. So, does that change the trajectory of, do you have places like Omaha and Council Bluffs and places further west, Denver? Do they have the sort of places in our heads that they do today, or do you start looking at, you know, Lubbock, Tucson or Tombstone to tease some other possible discussions we may have for a wild and wacky episode, places like that. And that then, dovetails to, okay, well, what do you do about the Indian Wars? That completely changes because now you're dealing with, instead of, the Lakota Sioux and the Black Hills, who I'll go ahead and put a spoiler, they're going to be quote unquote dealt with, to use the politically insensitive description at some point once we figure out there is gold in them, there hills. But you're going to start with like the Kiowa, some of the, the Apache in the Southwest, because now that you have this railroad, you have to have soldiers to defend it and preserve, the integrity of the railroad. Now, all of that is to set up a discussion that I've had in the back pocket this whole time, which is, who's everybody's favorite golden-haired blowhard from the 1870s who got a little too big for his britches fighting Indians? George Armstrong Custer.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, there's a very real possibility that the Little Bighorn is not this kind of peon to American military incompetence than it is at our timeline. There's a very real possibility that at some point Custer sticks around and becomes like a turtle dove-esque caricature of himself somehow.
I do not believe that. I believe that it's just going to be an Apache instead of a Sioux that doesn't
Or
win.
maybe it's Geronimo
gets
Yeah,
it.
so it's
Geronimo
one of
gets
the it's one of the South.
Yeah.
It's,
Not Sitting Bull, but Geronimo.
yep.
Yeah.
Well, and
That's
the
the
bigger
only
question
difference.
is, if you don't get a Gettysburg and that whole campaign, do you get a General Custer? Do you get the legend of Custer that you get that propels him to where if he does get wiped out by Geronimo, yeah, it's a bad deal, but is it as big because
he's just a no name basically. He's probably not even leading the theater.
He's literally just a lieutenant colonel.
Yeah. Or the question is, does he last long enough to somehow start having fun in the Spanish-American War, assuming it still happens? Because he would be, he'd be about to hit retirement. He'd be, the old police officer on the squad 2 days out from turning his badge in our timeline, basically. But I mean, he'd be around for the Spanish-American War. So, I just the Custer in 76 is always one of my favorite. Whatever butterfly flaps his wings, do we still kill Custer?
Yes, but the we is different. That's the only.
Yes, difference. Exactly. Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. But
Geronimo takes him out.
It's an interesting idea.
And by the way, we don't even dally in that he wasn't president. He's not going to be president. So
it's like the free one on our bingo card.
Yeah, he's further down the pecking order of what we do here. But again, I just got wrapped up in my head there because I hadn't thought through until Dylan uttered those words on Marshall Plan-esque, reconstruction. The alteration to I think it does. I think we're all pretty much in agreement. It alters the course of the actual conflict, the Civil War, which is inevitable.
Yes.
It's going to happen here. You're not going to divert it by this change, even though you tried to divert it as part of the compromise that we used as our launching off point. You get a different war fought in a different way, which does alter the way the war goes down and then starts to alter the way the peace goes down and then what happens in that peace period afterwards. And to your point, Dylan, this is the next big epoch of American history. Yes, it's Reconstruction going on, but it's the westward expansion, it's manifest destiny, it's all the stuff that goes with that. You're still going to get that, but if it has a more southern flavor to it, you're going to get a different version of it. And you're going to see other cities rise to prominence in ways, maybe a Lubbock, we can say this because Eric Rush isn't here, but maybe a Lubbock supplants a Kansas City in terms of size and scope, just because it's more in the path of what needs to happen there.
One of
Or
the things I'm thinking about is I don't know what the other football team in Texas is called, because you have this consistent, if you think about American culture, how much of it is the cowboy cattle drive from the plains of Texas up to the railheads of Kansas City?
right, versus the rail naturally going through Dallas, Fort Worth, and on across through there, and so the trails are short and they're what they are.
Amarillo. They all stop
Yeah,
in Amarillo.
yeah. And and again, I think it's a very different experience. It's still rugged territory that's not overly hospitable, so I don't think you're going to see tremendous amount of settlement in modern New Mexico, modern Arizona, just because it's hard to do that. Just like you really didn't see that much settlement really in Utah and Montana and places further north that were there, Wyoming. Um, but and I think Dylan made the point earlier, you're still going to have folks go across Kansas because there's value to going across Kansas. You're going to see another line go across there, but not the same federally funded line. We're not the same. Those economics are going to have to be for their own economics. They're not going to have to be from an artificial economics that was created by, you know, build a rail line here and we'll give you land, lots of cheap land, and do it in such a way that, it leads to the scandals that become the robber barons and Credit Mobilier.
Yeah. Well, and that was one of the reasons why I thought about it, because there's, you read a lot of biographies about Wyatt Earp and Tombstone and some of those mining towns out west in the Southwest. And their primary problem was that they ran out of water because they couldn't, it's just dusty towns in the middle of nowhere. So once you start moving railroad lines south, that then allows a whole lot of dusty mining towns that Clint Eastwood probably wandered through in a movie at some point, not likely to stick around, but at least some of them more likely to stick around. Like Tombstone, for one thing, would probably be a much bigger, modern day city than, sort of a ghost town. Because if you have a rail line, even if you can't get water locally, you at least can get some shipped in,
Right.
from other places. So it's that sort of alternative economic
Or,
development of,
frankly, even if just transportation runs through there, you need to have people to fix that rail line to service all of this transportation, if nothing else.
Wyatt Earp, railway mechanic.
Doesn't sound nearly as romantic, Dylan, but yeah, probably more realistic, right? In terms of what's going on. Well, and the other part that goes with that is, lest we forget the power of the railroads as they were crossing, it made and broke existing towns.
Yeah.
Whether the railroad went through your town or whether a town popped up because that's where the railroad went. I mean, deviations there of a couple of miles, were the death knell or the birth of nation of cities that towns that live till this day or don't live until this day, as the case might be.
Yeah. And then you have to kind of wonder, does that do things like, does it make Brigham Young, kind of more or less of a power player in, Utah politics because the railroads are down there? Does it do all that kind of stuff? I'm picturing a whole cottage industry of 1950s movies of, instead of, bandits out west, you have, Texas cattle ranchers who are having to fight the railroad from coming through their land and all that. Or at the same time, once you have attention turned south, do we start looking at Mexico again? Sonora and Chihuahua and other places like that. And, maybe
can please put down the turtle dove? You've talked about Custer, you're annexing Sonora and Chihuahua.
We can, we can also do Mexico City. I mean, we did that.
Yeah.
You're closer to the Panama Canal. But basically what I'm getting at is instead of shooting northwest, towards in a straight line to Seattle, do you start thinking about it more of in like a Baja direction? Or do you see, an earlier focus on South America? Does the Panama Canal or a version of it get built, a decade or two ahead of time? What does that do to the complete economic structure of, the country? I just keep going to turtle dove because it's just the easiest shorthand reference that some people, probably might know. And it's, how a lot of us got into alternate history. But I do have to think we probably would not start with Sonora and Chihuahua. we would probably just go straight south on the Gulf if we're talking about Texas
Veracruz.
railroads.
You go
Veracruz. Straight shoot down from Galveston and South Padre and just kind of
Because
go from there.
as we did in another episode, there's a lot of stuff going on in Mexico right now with Maximilian and yeah.
Well, in the other part there, I just thought
Wait, I just thought of your other Texas football team, the Texas Polkas. If we do that,
as long as I don't have to root for the other team in Texas, I'm okay.
Yeah.
But even thinking there, because we did an episode of this because of the 1900 storm and our proximity to it here in Houston, to what happened to Galveston. Galveston was the city on the rise until the 1900 storm. Houston grows out of that, the things that grow out of that. But imagine an even much more and because of railheads in this area too. That's part of the reason that Houston grew to its prominence. In addition to taking a bayou and turning it into a navigable sea channel up to a certain point, was the other part of that. After Galveston, after the hurricane in Galveston. But imagine a much more interconnected, East Texas with this more connected rail system, and that rail system is the more direct line that leads out west. You can easily see the prominence of the rise of some of those cities along the way. Maybe San Antonio becomes more of what it is in Longview, and Tyler, things up in northeast Texas that are there now. I do think you do alter the flow of that as well. And back to your point, Chris, this idea of cowboys driving cattle still happens, but it's not these long hundreds of miles, thousands of mile cattle drives, the Chisholm Trail kind of approach to thing. It's much more, the rail's running through the stockyard, where the stockyard's been built not that far from where the ranching's taking place.
And since he is not here to defend himself, this will teach you to have a life outside of this podcast. Kansas City barbecue is largely an outgrowth of from a historical perspective. It's an outgrowth of this. Right. So now maybe you have Memphis barbecue as more of a beef influence, or maybe you have a development of an Amarillo style barbecue, just shifting it further south. I said it was coming. I called my shot and said this was coming.
So we're saying without a doubt, and this is a little bit more inside baseball for our listeners who know the whole story here. At the end of the day, the whole purpose of this podcast is to talk about meat. At the end of the day, that is the purpose of this podcast. Yeah. History is just the nice veneer in the shell that we put over that and alternatives to that. But at the end of the day, it's about pork, potentially, if you're talking about Carolina barbecue as well. But yeah,
here's the other team, the Brazos Brats.
The Brazos brat? No, because you wouldn't have enough Germans down there for a bratwurst. Come on, man.
Oh, yes, you do.
Oh, we do have a fairly intense German immigrant population there in that little part, or not far from there, near in central Texas. Places like Schulenburg and Frederick. Lots of towns that ends in Berg.
I didn't think about that. You're right.
Braunfels, Fredericksburg, Schulenburg.
Lots of towns that end in Berg. We'll just leave it
West
at that.
Texas, the home of the Kolache.
And do they then take, instead of Johnsonville, do they take over the bratwurst shipping game? Do we all basically just eat every 4th of July brats that are licensed from an NFL team?
Well, never underestimate the power of Big Brat. That's all I'm saying. At the end of the day, never underestimate the power of Big Brat. I think we've about squeezed on this iteration all we can out of this episode.
We've squeezed all the juice out of this brat. Is what you're trying to say?
There you go. There you go. But we'll let the topic marinate a little bit more and come back to it at another point. Because again, history is just the cover here. Those of you that have been listening long enough have figured it out. That's really what we are. We're the Trojan horse, using history as the way to get into food debates. But what we do encourage you to do as listeners is I'm going to try to make this into a good segue and a value way is we do encourage our listeners to visit us on our website. That's www.aforkandtimepodcast.com, but particularly on our Discord servers. And by the way, we're not selling secrets there. You know, Discord got a bad name here in the last year because of how some things got used there, but it's a place that gamers started. It's a place that we've set up that is a place for our community. We like to think of ourselves and our listeners as a community, even though we're in a one-way audio medium called a podcast, which makes it a little bit challenging, but it's a place for feedback. If something said or not said, and there was probably a little bit of both on this episode, got you thinking, you know, they did not think about this at all. Why in the world did those idiots not think of that? Or why in the world did those idiots say that? Whatever it is that's got you riled up, there's a place to go on our Discord server, providing feedback on the website. And one of the things that we're coming up on here, it happened sometime within the next month, we talked about this during our live stream in our 200th episode, is we're going to regularly have these feedback episodes where we circle back around. And the intentional goal there is to use the feedback that we've seen and the conversations that have happened on the Discord server to further the discussion on the topic, bringing in the viewpoints of our listeners as well. So again, this episode may be a good case of that. If you heard something you liked or didn't like here, either way, just go constructively engage with us on the Discord server, and you'll get responses back from us there. We have even already have some running inside jokes with some of the folks that are there, so we invite you to come and be part of what's going on there. And that's part of what I've enjoyed even more than I already enjoyed doing what we do here and meeting the people I've met along the way, as we've said here on the podcast. But it's interacting with folks that are in the UK and down under and all kinds of other places that I get to hear their thoughts on various things that are there. The other thing I'll just mention is a reminder that there are benefits for our patrons if you're not a patron. A few of our listeners that participate actively there on Discord are patrons, and so they will have heard this episode about a week to a week and a half earlier than those of you that are listening on the live feed, the regular feed. And so among the other things that are there for our patrons, for as little as $2 a month, you can help support the show if you can financially. We'll always keep our regular episodes free, and we just appreciate your time and your investment by listening to us. But if you want to help us out a little bit and want to get some perks from that, I invite you to check out our Patreon page and see what's there. That's also, by the way, we're working on, we know what our next topic is going to be for a room where it happened. Armitage Shanks will like that because he likes to air violin. Again, if you were on the Discord server, you'd know what we were talking about. And but that's now, you will find it on the feed here. So the room where it happened will just show up here as a Fork in Times do. But if you're looking for the archive for the room where it happened, that's actually over on the Patreon page. Those archived episodes are free. So the Patreon page has a mixture of the early access stuff that's there that's posted, but also the free archive for room where it happened. I can't think of anything else that I need to relate out to the listeners. Can you guys think of anything? Okay.
No.
We appreciate you guys joining us today, giving us a little time. Again, as we always say, we do this. I think we do this mainly also as a cover for us just to have good fun talking to each other before and after episodes. But it's nice that we do this part here for everybody else. And our reminder, as always, as the Fork in Time team, is if you happen upon a fork in time, our strong suggestion is to take it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.